Good afternoon, everyone. Professor Green here. Hope you're doing well as we get into week 6 of English 113. I'm going to do a little brief PowerPoint about the elements of fiction. So this week we're going to look at several elements in fictional writing, fictional stories, short stories. Plot, characterization, setting, point of view, symbolism, theme, style and tone, and irony. These are all of the elements that you will want to consider to use when you think about writing your literary analysis essay this week. So first, let's start with plot. Plot is the order of events that make up a story. It's your basic beginning, middle, and end. What's the problem? What's the solution? Every story has to have some sort of problem that gets solved in order to have a plot. And there's two different approaches to a plot line. There's the realistic plot, which can be the literal events that happen, the real actual events. But there can also be a surrealistic level where there's an underlying level of symbolism of things that represent something. So be looking, when you read your short stories, be looking at the different approaches, the realistic and the surrealistic approaches to a plotline development. Your basic plot diagram is kind of like a mountain peak, where you have your beginning, your exposition, you're getting the story going, introducing your characters and your setting, and then you have your rising action. This is where, once you've met your characters, you figure out what the conflict is, what's the problem, things kind of build up, and then you have your climax or your turning point in the story, and then your falling action is where things come together and you have your denouement or your resolution, and that's where the problem is finally solved. Sometimes you'll see this mountain peak as a very standard split in the middle, kind of like a bell curve, a straight up and then halfway and straight down. But if you think about it, most books that you've ever read or movies that you've ever watched don't have the climax in the middle of the book or the middle of the movie. It's always right near the end, and then it kind of wraps up rather quickly. So I liked this this graph a lot better because it shows a more realistic approach to the way that the plot diagram unfolds. Characterization is the next literary term, and I'm going to use from our short stories in our reading this week. I'm going to reference The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. I think that is just one example, but I'll reference over and over when we go through these terms. So in characterization, basically this is the way that the author brings the characters to life. Okay, every work of fiction is going to have characters. And the way that the characters are portrayed gives the story style. It makes us to be able to relate to the character, to feel feelings for the protagonist, and to feel the angst or that bad guy, that antagonist. The way that this person brings these characters to develop really helps us to relate to the story. There's different approaches in characterization. There's a psychological approach, and that's where we can understand how do the characters think and behave. Why do they do the things that they do? Why do they feel a certain way? And then there's the ethical and the social. The ethical is the moral compass between who's good in the story and who's bad, their ethical decisions, their choices. And then the social aspect is how the character behaves with other characters. So think of these three approaches if you are analyzing characters in your literary analysis. Be able to look into these different aspects. As far as the character perspectives, you will always have a character, a protagonist, which is basically your good guy, and then your antagonist, which is your bad guy. Every story has to have these characters opposing each other, solving some sort of problem. It's in nature to have a good versus evil. Sometimes your characters will have a conflict with another character. Many times they'll also have a conflict within themselves. Character versus character, character versus society, or character versus themselves, and some sort of internal dilemma. So be thinking about that as well. And then another thing I want to point out is the term static versus dynamic when you're looking at your characters. And be thinking of this. Static is something that stays the same. So the character throughout the course of a story doesn't change. They don't evolve. They don't have a great epiphany. They're just kind of there. And then the dynamic character is the character that goes through some great change, has an aha moment, has some sort of behavioral, emotional, psychological development or change from the beginning to the end of the story. So, for example, in the story of an hour, the static character would be Mr. Mallard. He's a character in the story, even though we don't ever meet him until the end, but he's there. He's just Mr. Mallard, and we thought he was deceased. But he's so important because without him, we wouldn't see the development of the dynamic characterization of Mrs. Mallard. So Mrs. Mallard goes through this whole range of emotions when she hears that her husband has died. And at first, we think she's just so traumatized and she's so grief-stricken. But in the end, we see that she's changed, and we finally realize that it was this... she was so elated and so happy to be free, and we don't realize that until it develops in the end and Mr. Mallard comes back. So he doesn't change, he dead or not dead, he's just Mr. Mallard. He doesn't do anything in the story. He's static. But without him, we wouldn't be able to see how her emotional development progresses in the story. Okay, the next literary term we're going to look at is setting. Setting is really simple. It's just where the story takes place. And the reason that setting is important is because the way that the author develops the setting will enhance the theme, the mood, and the overall tone or attitude of the story. So, for example, in paragraphs 4 and 5 of the story of an hour, we see this mood, this feeling when the author describes the location. She says, "There stood facing the open window a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of the trees were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air." And it goes on. So you can see there's this feeling that comes out in just describing what it looks like where they're at. So the setting can be very important in setting a mood or a feeling for the reader. The point of view is the perspective by which the story is told, and generally you will see one of two. You'll see third person point of view or first person. Third person is where the narrator is not a part of the story. They're just an objective person who happens to be seeing everything, telling us what everyone's doing and thinking and feeling, but they are not part of the story. First person, on the other hand, is where the narrator is actually a character in the story. And the way that you'll know the difference is because you'll see those personal pronouns like we and me and my, where that narrator is in the story. Symbolism. Symbolism can be a little bit tricky for those who have difficulty reading deeper into things and getting deeper meanings. Symbolism it's just when something represents something else. And this can be conveyed in many different ways. It can be developed in the characters. The characters can represent things. It can be mentioned in objects in the story or in certain events that happen in the story. They can be symbolic for events. For example, sometimes in a story you'll hear of someone taking a shower or taking a bath or getting wet. And symbolically, if this is talking about some sort of transformation, it could be symbolism for this person being cleansed of their sins, washed away of the evil, something like that. Theme is the lesson to be learned in the story or the deeper meaning, the central idea. Sometimes you will see symbols used in order to represent themes in a story. And if you're having to find a theme, one rather easy way to do that is to find the main subject or character in the story and then ask yourself, what's the author trying to say about this person? or this event. Okay, so for example, if we look at Mrs. Mallard as our focal point in the story, you would say, what is the author trying to say about her and about her reaction to the news of the death of her husband? And the beauty about theme is that there's no right or wrong answer. There are many different themes, there's many different perspectives, and it's all up to your interpretation and how you are able to justify it. Okay, and the last chunk of literary terms we're going to look at kind of go together, and that is style, tone, and irony. Style is the manner in which the writer writes, the way that they arrange their words in order to achieve this feeling or this desired effect. Is it sarcasm? Is it somber and serious, like this story? Is it humorous? What's their style of writing? Sometimes you'll see a style of very sophisticated, big words with a lot of dashes and hyphens and grammar, and it's a really complex style. Sometimes there's short sentences, very simple. Tone is the other term. Writing styles reveal the author's tone or the attitude conveyed. So what's the attitude about the subject? Tone and style, very similar, often confused for each other, but the style is the feeling, and the tone is the attitude. And then irony is the last one. In irony, when something's ironic, it's the difference between what you expect something to be and what it literally is. And we can certainly say that The Story of an Hour was full of irony, because we expected at the beginning, based on what we were reading, this dramatic, grief-stricken wife who's just traumatized by this news. And then as we read toward the end, we hear this, we see her yelling, "Free, body and soul, free," but then it goes on and it says, no, she was drinking in the very elixir of life through that open window. And she was praying, and at first you would think, oh, she's praying, to get through this horrible event. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday that she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. And so there's this humor and this irony that, oh my goodness, she's not grief-stricken. She's celebrating. And so that's definitely an opposite of what you'd expect. So these are the literary terms that you're looking at when we do our literary analysis. And you're not going to be expected to cover all of them. When you do your literary analysis, you want to pick something that you like and that you're comfortable with, and then you can focus on that with whatever piece of literature that you choose. And with that, I am going to close, and we will have one more lecture on the second part of this class.